Yo, MTV Raps. Oh my God. So, we just barely made it. We just barely made it. So I'm back for now. I have an episode for you. We're in season 4, episode 12. Thank you for coming by. Thanks for hanging out with me. I got a 2-parter. I didn't know it was going to be a 2-parter, but since I skipped a week and I was like, you know what, let's just give the people what they want. Not that nobody's asking, but I do have a 2-parter for you. This is probably going to be along the lines of blackmail. I'm sorry. I said that I wasn't going to do this again, but it was on my list and I should have just shut up. But sometimes things don't work out as planned. So it is what it is, but it's going to be some very interesting information. Probably not as boring as blackmail episode, but it's a lot. There's a lot here. Thank you to everyone who wished me happy birthday or who bought me gifts or who took me out or whatever. I appreciate it so much. I had a good time. I turned 40 this year and I'm grateful for another one. That's all we could do at this point. I did stuff. I went to go see the Candlelight Hans Zimmer, which was super fun. I went to this really cool restaurant with Sal in Wicker Park. I went out with Dustin. I ended up going to Air to go just enjoy a bath and relax. I got a trip to Antigua in June. So I'm okay. I'm doing okay. I cannot complain. I really cannot complain. So, but I appreciate you all coming back. Just want to update you on that. I almost didn't do this episode, but I'm glad that I did because it feels good to kind of check it off. I kind of hate when I do part 2s though, because it's kind of like it's a never ending season. But this is episode 12. We still have 8 episodes left. So you have me for another 16 weeks? I don't know. Let's just hope that I blast through this. I'm kind of on hiatus, kind of not. Still wrapping my show, but I'll be around. I'm going to try to be more consistent now that I have a little more time. I'm not weighed down by a hit television show. So there's that. So what are we talking about today? Today we're going to be talking about Lawrence E. King Jr. and the Franklin scandal. I brought this up in the blackmail episode. I learned about this in the blackmail episode. I mentioned it in the blackmail episode. Try to find it. If you didn't notice, go back to the old episodes and try to find it. But I mentioned it and I knew that I was going to do it. I did. It was, I kind of have all of my topics written. And since I did the blackmail episode, I was like, you know what? It's fresh. I don't want to wait too far into the season to do this. So I'm just going to do it. And it doesn't we're not even going to talk about Epstein. So you don't have to worry. Because I told you all, I'm done with him. I'm so done with him. For this episode, I read The Franklin Cover-Up, Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska by John DeCamp, released in 1992. I watched an old Discovery documentary that was shelved. It was never released. The link is in the show notes if you want to check that out. It was very interesting. This week, we're heading to Omaha, Nebraska to untangle the web of the Franklin Credit Union scandal, a case where $40 million went missing, and the investigation ended up leading to something way more sinister. So there's that. But who is John DeCamp, this author? It's important to note and mention him because I'll be mentioning him a lot. He was born John William DeCamp on July 6, 1941 in Neligh. I think that's how you pronounce that, Nebraska. Or Nellie. Maybe it's Nellie. Whatever. DeCamp was a Republican Nebraska state senator. He was representing the 4th District for 16 years from 1971 to 1987. But before that, he served in the Army during Vietnam War. And he worked as an aide to William Kobe, who later became the director of the CIA. That's going to be important later. But during this time, he was known as a strong advocate for veterans. In 1988, he transitioned to a legal advocate and a whistleblower. So we're going to be reading his work. The poison on this episode is the Vixen. I found this actually. 1 1/2 ounce reposado tequila, 1 ounce of sherry, 3/4 ounce of champagne, corn cob syrup, which I wanted something that was like Nebraska-ish. So, take that however. I don't know what that's going to taste like. Champagne corn cob syrup. Yeah. And a garnish, lemon twist if you waste fruit. But you combine all those ingredients in a rocks glass filled with ice, and you stir thoroughly while chilled, and you finish the drink off with a lemon twist, and boom. I haven't been drinking, man. I'm not drinking today, believe it or not. I got really drunk for my birthday, and I was like, yeah, maybe I should slow down a little bit. So, also I'm back in the gym trying to get bathing suit ready for Antigua. I would just like to say that you will be hearing me drink water on this episode. Your girl is I'm kind of getting sick of being drunk. I'm not gonna lie. So sip. Let me clear my throat. Okay. Now, before we begin, I want to start with a disclaimer. This episode discusses allegations detailed in the Franklin cover-up by John DeCamp, but these accounts involve very, very sensitive subject matter, including child abuse in all its forms like assault, murder, mutilation, etc. So please be advised that the theories presented in the book are disputed and includes testimony that was never successfully prosecuted in the court of law, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Now, you're probably like, did she just give a disclaimer? Yeah, I'm going to give one. And I'm going to give one more so because of some of the testimony is pretty bad. As I was reading this, I was like, yikes, this is awful. But it will give us some context I feel like it provides enough context to actually feel the space for what we today deem as so ridiculous that it can't be true. I always kind of lean into things that can't possibly be true because sometimes they really are. And a lot of what we are learning about a lot of people are not far-fetched. And in the very, very deep recesses of time has already happened. History always repeats itself. So just remember that as we're going through this, and obviously take things with a grain of salt. But I am one that will believe the victims. To me, it's kind of up to you to prove them wrong. So there's that. Now let's start from the beginning. Nebraska in the 1980s was not having the best of times. I mean, the Great Farm Crisis in the late 1970s was the worst for agriculture since the Great Depression. So high interest rates and tanking land values caused hundreds of farms and small town banks to collapse. Between 1980 and 1985, the land values dropped by 50% in Nebraska. And this created a distrust towards the big city banks, specifically the ones in Lincoln. Now, Nebraska has the only nonpartisan one-house unicameral, unicameral legislature in the U.S. This was designed to encourage civility and independent thinking, but instead it created an insane power vacuum. Most of the state's political and financial power was concentrated in a small circle of families and business leaders in two cities, Lincoln and Omaha. And because there was no formal party caucuses, power was concentrated in these side networks. So if you were in with the committee chairs and the governor, you can get away with a lot without the oversight of the opposition party. Nebraska had just elected a new governor in 1982, Robert Carey, and he was a young Medal of Honor recipient who had lost part of his leg in Vietnam and a Democrat. in a heavily Republican state. He was seen as the state hero. He took office in 1983. Kerry and DeCamp both served separately in Vietnam. Kerry was Navy SEAL. DeCamp was Army. Remember, DeCamp is our author. He was Army infantry captain in Mekong Delta. They had known each other, though, for over 20 years, but eventually DeCamp couldn't take it anymore. Nebraska had become what he called a wide open state, a term used to describe political machines controlled by organized crime, and Robert Kerry's administration was no different. Now, I'm explaining this because it's important for us to understand that Nebraska wasn't just about corn, okay, or whatever else is in Nebraska. It was ripe with corruption. And truthfully, financial crises are usually a result of corruption or a breeding ground for corruption, or both. DeCamp quotes Kerry as telling a business associate in 1981 that he entered politics to, quote, make money. Kerry reportedly complained that in the private sector, one had to actually produce something to get rich, whereas in politics, that offered a different path to wealth. Kerry proceeded to make money while Nebraska's banks collapsed. Paul Amen was the director of the Nebraska Department of Banking and Finance from 1979 to late 1983. Amen was the one who brought the secret list of failing banks to Governor-elect Kerry and his advisor. Bill Wright, despite Wright being the president of one of those failing banks, he brought him in too. Now, on October 31st, 1983, Kerry issued a late afternoon press release regarding the bank's stability. And in it, he stated, quote, "We are monitoring the activities of Commonwealth. We are looking at the institution with more interest than we are the other institutions which we monitor." The public interpreted this as a sign of impending doom. By the next morning, November 1st, 1983, panicked citizens mobbed the bank to withdraw their life savings. Because of the massive influx of withdrawal requests, state authorities were forced to shut the bank's doors by that afternoon. Now enter the fall of the Commonwealth Savings Company. Now, Commonwealth Savings was owned by this family, the Koppel family, who were forced to surrender the company and personal assets to the state to pay back depositors right before the bank failed and right after being pressured by Paul Amen. DeCamp includes a quote from a reporter, Nate Bomberg. "Everybody was in on the take. You can't have an underworld without an overworld. You can't have the rackets unless you have the mayor, the chief of the police, and the county attorney in your corner." While Kerry was running for governor, he and his associates, including his legal counsel, were involved in numerous real estate projects funded by the very banks that eventually failed. According to DeCamp, Kerry and his advisor Bill Wright, who was the president and leading stockholder of the State Security Savings Bank, just like Jesus, they allegedly used the powers of the state's government to divert between $4 million and $10 million from state securities depositors, caused the loss of at least $40 million from Commonwealth savings depositors, created a new state agency, the Nebraska Investment Finance Authority, specifically to funnel millions in low interest loans to Kerry's associates, to cheat farmers out of $200 million in subsidized loans, to peddle junk bonds to investors under the guise of high-grade state bonds. And State Security Savings Bank had made many personal loans to Kerry before he became governor. It was an absolute mess. John DeCamp was appointed as the chairman of the special committee of the Nebraska legislature to investigate the failure of Commonwealth Savings Company and determine if the state banking department and the Kerry administration had acted improperly or if there was a deliberate effort by the Kerry administration to protect certain interests at the expense of the depositors. The committee faced roadblocks when they were trying to access confidential banking files because there were attempts to use executive privilege to prevent state employees from testifying about the private meetings between Kerry, Bill Wright, and Paul Amin. Now, what does this have to do with Franklin's scandal? Nebraska likes to cover shit up. According to DeCamp, the systematic demolition of Commonwealth was a trial run. It was the literal blueprint for the absolute slaughter that would eventually go down at the Franklin Credit Union. You can't have a criminal underworld without an overworld that protects it. We talked about this in my blackmail episodes. The Nebraska establishment was willing to sacrifice the life savings of thousands of citizens to protect political reputations. Commonwealth proved that the system was rigged, and the networks needed political slush funds. For what? To discredit witnesses. They needed it to hide documents. They needed to engage in political intimidation. They needed all of those things. But why do they need any of that? Why do they need to do any of that? So welcome, Lawrence E. King Jr. Born in 1944 in Omaha, Nebraska. We don't have a month or a day, apparently. He's not dead. He's still alive. And King grew up and became a central figure in Nebraska's civic life. He was a U.S. Air Force veteran between 1965 and 1969. He married Alice King and had one son, Prince. King was appointed as the manager of the Franklin Company Federal Credit Union, the FCFCU, in Nebraska. Now, for a brief period between 1968 and his discharge in 1969, King effectively balanced his final military obligations with his new role at the credit union. The credit union was established in Omaha's North Side, which was a predominantly African-American neighborhood during the Civil Rights Movement, and was founded with a goal to provide financial services to low-income residents who were redlined or ignored by traditional banks. Now, at the time, it was a small, struggling institution. King made it through federal regulatory processes to obtain a charter for the National Credit Union Administration, the NCUA. And this was a big deal for a young black man in the late 60s. This immediately positioned him as a community leader. King acted as a visionary who could bridge the gap between the impoverished local community and the federal government. But from the beginning, King used his political savvy to frame the credit union as a tool for black capitalism. By the time the 1980s arrived, he has successfully leveraged his local success into a national platform within the Republican Party. He was known for his charisma and his ability to bridge the gap between Omaha's North Side and the city's wealthy elites. Now, the Kings, as in the family, were also well known for hosting lavish high society parties at their home, which were frequently attended by the powerful politicians and local VIPs. King was a prominent black Republican, which is very weird to say, and a high-level Republican fundraiser. He served on numerous prestigious boards, including the Boys and Girls Club of Omaha. He was treasurer of the Franklin Company Credit Union. The Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. President of Consumer Services Organizations, Inc., a restaurateur, a caterer, a chairman of the Business Coordinating Committee for the National Black Republican Council. And in 1984, he was Man of the Year for the New York State Council of Black Republicans. King was even a talented singer who would perform at the 1984 Republican National Convention, which solidified his image as a loyal and useful party asset.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chair now recognizes Lawrence King Jr., a member of the Nebraska delegation, for the singing of the national anthem.
Now, by 1985, mid-1985, King was under consideration for a presidential appointment to the board of directors of the National Consumer Cooperative Bank. He was being considered as a representative of low-income cooperatives. The appointment reached the stage of, quote, prospective appointee, with the White House initiating security clearances and requesting personal data and financial disclosure forms in summer 1985. But by late July 1985, King formally declined. I would probably say that was likely because of the financial disclosures part. King stated that he was deeply honored, but he needed to focus his efforts on the National Black Republican Council, the NBRC. He felt he was a greater asset to the Republican Party by helping revive the council following the loss of its director, Legree Daniels. Now, King cultivated an image of taking from the system to help the poor, a narrative he used to deflect criticism of his financial management. While it all started as a legitimate effort to help the community, DeCamp explains how the institution eventually became King's personal piggy bank. How? With a $16,200 salary, which is, if he was making that in 1968, to 2026 terms would be $150,000. If he was making that in 1980, that would be $65,000 in 2026 dollars. How, with the $16,200 salary, is King living like a millionaire? He was spending $10,000 a month on limousines. He owned a $70,000 Mercedes. He had $1 million credit card balance and 26-acre estate and $100,000 parties that he hosted for the RNC, the Republican National Conventions. Now, employees witnessed King moving large sums of money in ways that bypassed standard credit union regulations. He maintained strict control over his staff, though. And because of his close ties to the Omaha Police Department, employees felt that they had no one to turn to if they wanted to report his behavior. Now, the first sign of trouble at Franklin were the early audits. The early audits suggested that millions of dollars were unaccounted for, $40 million to be exact. The missing funds, quote unquote, were linked to certificates of deposit sold by Franklin. Notably, at least 8 million of those came from charitable institutions like churches and foundations, and it was intended to aid low-income individuals. Now, he apparently ran this operation where he was peddling high-interest CDs to attract deposits that were then used to fund all of his vices. All of them. Shopping, clothes, cars, everything. Federal examiners have failed to audit the books for 4 years. Investigators were kind of confused because they're like, how does such a large sum just vanish from a small credit union designed specifically to help the poor? But while money was coming in, it was no longer reflected in the institution's assets. So, like I mentioned, King lived far beyond the means of a credit union manager. He was riding in limousines. He was taking private jets. But he also had these big, crazy parties that were attended by mayors, judges, high-ranking police officials. By providing an atmosphere of luxury and access, King made himself untouchable. King's influence allowed him to attract support from several prominent Omahans. For instance, former Mayor John Callinger, who served as the board member of one of King's organizations. But just like with Commonwealth, the state and the federal regulatory bodies seemed hesitant to move against King because of his powerful political friends. So between 1985 and 1987, federal examiners, the NCUA, began noting huge irregularities and missing funds. But King's high-level political connections in D.C. and Nebraska kept those audits at bay. It wouldn't be until November 1988 that federal regulators from the NCUA moved in, backed by armed federal marshals. The Franklin Credit Union collapsed. During the raid, investigators found that many files were missing or had been tampered with, suggesting that there was a high degree of premeditated embezzlement. King's response to the raid was indignant outrage. King initially claimed that the federal government was targeting him because he was a successful Black Republican and that the raid was racially motivated. It was an attempt to destroy the institution serving the Black community. He reached out to his high-level contacts in the GOP. Now, days later, State Senator Loran Schmidt introduced a legislative resolution for a formal probe. Now, at this stage, the focus is strictly on embezzlement. The first special hearings began in December, and during these early sessions, strands of evidence regarding King's personal life began to surface, moving beyond banking. And soon investigators were approached by local social workers and foster care advocates. These individuals reported that King wasn't just moving money, he was moving children. The first accounts claimed that children were being borrowed from foster homes for King's parties. This just escalated from a financial scandal into a criminal investigation of child abuse. A 3.5-hour hearing occurs. The Foster Care Review Board, with Carol Stitt and Dennis Carlson, presents the files on the Webb foster home. They warn the committee of cult activities, sacrifices of small children, and sexual abuse. Stitt confirmed that the common denominator is Larry King, whom she describes as the organizer or a high-class pimp. When you look at him, he does look like a high-class pimp. He does. Now, Stitt testified about a June 1988 letter she sent to the Attorney General Spire regarding King's activities in Kansas City. Kansas City detective reportedly inquired about when Nebraska was going to finally crack down on King. But the detective confirmed that King had contributed money to a local group home, which I'm like, okay. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, he contributed money to a local group home. It's fine. Just ignore the child sex abuse. After he left, 3 boys came forward alleging that they had been abused by him during his visit. The board also reviewed a 1986 interview report by Julie Walters, who worked with the teenage victims. And Walters admitted that the children's stories originally seemed too bizarre to be true. Walters told reporters James Allen Flannery of the Omaha World Herald that she was more sure than ever that there is more truth than not to their claims. Now, the first official alarm technically sounded off in June of 1985. Okay. The investigation into the personal life of the Franklin people began not with financial fraud, but with child abuse complaints that were filed with the Washington County Sheriff's Department. The case involved 3 foster children, Sean, Sally, and Steve MacArthur, who were living with Jarrett and Barbara Webb in Fort Calhoun. Jarrett Webb worked for the Omaha Public Power District and was a board member of the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. His wife, Barbara Webb, is the cousin of Larry Lawrence King Jr. The Webb's foster operation was significant, with as many as 9 children in the house at once. In August of 1985, 2 children, Kimberly, age 14, and Michael, ran away, but were returned to the home. By November 1985, 16-year-old Nellie Patterson Webb fled to her grandmother's house to escape the home. And when deputies picked up the children, they found physical evidence of severe mistreatment. Sean MacArthur had welts and scratches across his back. Sean stated that the Webbs had beaten him with a railroad iron and a belt, which is like, what? Joey Patterson, the Webb's 16-year-old son, also complained about being beaten by his parents. The children told social workers that the beatings had been happening for quite some time, but they were too afraid to report it previously. By December 18, 1985, the Department of Social Services had officially documented these incidents, and they marked them as the first time the Franklin family was formally flagged for violence against children in their care. Now, Julie Walters revealed that while the Webbs were away, the foster children snooped. They snooped through the house. They found a bag under the Webb's bed containing pornographic videos, including one specifically showing teenagers involved in sexual activity. Nellie and Kimberly claimed they overheard that Larry King had supplied these tapes to the Webbs. There were also pornographic magazines kept in the basement. One foster child, Sean, was reportedly denied food for an entire week as punishment for being suspected of looking at them. There was a box of novels also in Mrs. Webb's closet, which was described as containing themes of incest, mothers having sex with their sons, and stacks of large photograph envelopes marked "Do Not Bend" were found in a closet, along with photos of naked women in a dresser drawer. Now, by January 1986, Nellie Patterson was being interviewed by the State Patrol investigator, Jane F. Tooley, and provided a detailed account of sexual trauma inflicted by her foster father, Jared Webb. This was spanning over several years. She stated that the abuse began when she was approximately 9 or 10 years old. She described instances of forced French kissing that left her unable to breathe, and an incident where Jared made her nap in his bed while he played with all of her body parts and digitally penetrated her. As she grew older, ages 10 and 11, Jared would call her into his room at night. If he resisted, he threatened her with whippings to ensure her compliance. She remembered being pulled onto him while he was naked under the sheets. She could feel his hair against her leg. Now, Kimberly and Nellie were adamant that they would never return to the Webb's house. Not at all. Jared Webb allegedly ordered Nellie to undress and lie on a bed where he beat her with a rubber strap. He then forced her onto her back and sexually assaulted her. Nellie stated that she began crying, at which point Webb finally left the room. The sexual abuse of Nellie by Jared Webb was supported by a polygraph test that Nellie passed on January 30th, 1986. By February 1986, the DSS, the Department of Social Services, moved for the emergency removal of the remaining children, Kendra and Michael, from the Webb home. The Webbs were presented by attorney Gary Randall, represented that is. And his brother, Casey Randall, was an associate of Larry King's and was nicknamed Larry's maid by the children. Now, despite Jared Webb stating at a hearing that he earned $32,000 per year, their home was furnished with $2,000 paintings, crystals, silver, and multiple high-end electronics. Mrs. Webb was known also for wearing 4-carat diamond ring, a full-length fur coat, and custom-made dresses. When the Webbs hosted parties, they utilized caterers and limousines, costs that exceeded a $32,000 annual salary. King would call the Webb house and give them specific time frame, usually just minutes, to have children like Joey or Nellie ready for pickup. Nellie emphasized that the children had no choice in whether they attended. They were either driven to King's home by the Webbs or picked up by King personally in his limo. And while Nellie attended only once at age 14, she said that Joey attended regularly from the seventh grade, which is roughly 12, 13 years old, until he left the home. Now, parties typically included 10 to 15 older men and about 25 young teenage girls. The girls were required to sign a brown book belonging to Larry King when they arrived. And King preferred white guests. He claimed, allegedly, that, quote, blacks get ignorant when they drink and tighter with their money, whereas whites spend more money when they're drunk. Kimberly identified 4 boys who had attended King's parties during the summers after examining Boys Town yearbooks from 1983 through 1985. Now, Boys Town is now officially Girls in Boys Town, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the care and treatment of at-risk children and families. King and his cohorts targeted these children specifically because they were vulnerable, lacked family advocates, and were easily transported in the network's limousines or private planes. Nellie remembered a youth named Brent, who told her he was being flown to another city somewhere in Larry's private plane to, quote unquote, work for someone else, following a disagreement with King. Brent's photo was absent from the yearbooks. This kind of suggested that maybe he had been moved through the network before being officially documented. Now, King's parties were pay to play. If a man was interested in a young girl, he would hold out a folded $50 or $100 bill and whisper in her ear before taking her to an upstairs room. Nellie and Kimberly reported that the girls were required to give half of their money they received directly to Larry King, which is a pimp in a real sense. Additionally, King reportedly gave some of the boys at these parties new cars in exchange for their cooperation and work. King leveraged his social status, claiming to donate to Boys Town and serve on the board of directors of the Omaha Girls Club. This was just to gain access to vulnerable youth. He lured boys to his home under the guise of doing, quote, yard work. Nellie testified that the King had a bad temper and would threaten young men that they would get hurt if they refused his demands. Beginning when she was 15, Nellie accompanied Larry King and his wife on trips to Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. She was taken on these trips under the pretense of being a babysitter for King's son, Prince. But on these trips, Nellie claimed to have met a very high-ranking national official that she referred to or was referred to in the notes as VP. Now, this VP, Nellie Patterson Webb alleged to have met during her trips to Washington, D.C., was George H.W. Bush, who was VP at the time. Nellie alleged that she saw him twice, first in Washington and again at one of the private parties Larry King hosted. Now, Nellie describes these gatherings as involving older men and younger men in their early 20s, where she witnessed acts of sodomy. At some parties, King would bring in local prostitutes, and they would be in like 20 to 30s range, specifically to entertain the male guests. But every guest was required to produce a card that was run through this verification machine to confirm their identity. So this is advanced. And every guest was frisked before entering the party. Nellie noticed that every guest had a personal bodyguard, and many of these guards were visibly armed. Now, Fort Calhoun school officials, you know what that just reminded me of as I was reading it? It kind of reminded me of Eyes Wide Shut. I recently rewatched that movie. I had gone through like a week where like the subject matter had just like fascinated me because I hadn't seen it since it first came out. And I wasn't really in love with it. Like I like some Stanley Kubrick films, but a lot of them I can just not watch. Like 2001 is a 2-hour space space saver or screensaver. I said space saver. 2001: A Space Odyssey is just too long and too boring. But his film Eyes Wide Shut with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman has a scene where they obviously go to a masquerade. There's a lot of open sex, and there are nude women in masks who walk around just basically grabbing men who have on masks and robes. And then there are these like other characters who kind of stand around and like act like guards to kind of like keep the guests under control. So it was just the way she described that made me think of that. Now, Fort Calhoun school officials, specifically DeWard Finch and Kent Miller, were good friends with the Washington County prosecutor, Pat Tripp. DeWard Finch was the superintendent and Kent Miller was the principal. They would frequently, allegedly, call the Webb's house for meetings during school hours. And Kimberly Webb said that Finch would interrupt his schedule the moment the Webbs arrived. He was meeting with them in his office for hours. She also claimed to have overheard Mrs. Webb discussing catching Finch with young girls, suggesting that they used these vices that they shared as a way to keep local officials compromised and compliant. We talked about that. Compromat. Mrs. Webb reportedly carried a very large Gucci bag with photo envelopes similar to those found in her closet. She took this bag into her meetings and explicitly told Kimberly that she was going to show the officials pictures from their trip. With all of that, the Walters report and the DSS logs, which contain detailed eyewitness accounts of child pornography and prostitution, County Prosecutor Patrick Tripp publicly called Nellie Patterson a liar. Even though she had passed 4 separate lie detector tests, lie detector tests, but not a single person was indicted based on the 1986 evidence. Jared and Barbara Webb went free. And while these children's lives were basically left in absolute shambles, the Republican establishment was still rolling out the red carpet for Larry King. Just like in 1984, King was invited back as a guest of honor to belt out the Star-Spangled Banner at the 1988 Republican National Convention, proving once again that in Nebraska, the show must go on regardless of the rot underneath. Now, in May 1988, Margot Georgiou and her 17-year-old daughter, Brenda Parker, filed a formal complaint with the Omaha Police Department, the OPD, complaining that an Omaha photographer named Rusty Nelson engaged in possible child pornography. Nelson had allegedly used the pretense of working for the Easter Seals campaign and was building a European portfolio to recruit Brenda for a photograph session at his studio in the Twin Towers. Now, while he did not explicitly ask her to pose nude, he pressured her to show as much skin as possible and wear provocative lingerie. During the session, Brenda's mother observed several photographs of other nude females ranging from early teens to their 20s. They were just scattered about the apartment in the same building that coincidentally Larry King had a $50,000 decorated luxury penthouse in the Twin Towers. Evidence found in Nelson's studio included numerous photographs of naked females ranging from early teens to their 20s. And he admitted that he was self-employed, but he made multiple references to the boss who kept the studio well-stocked and who allowed him to stay there rent-free. I find it very interesting that the details that people are willing to tell. I think that a lot of people, specifically psychopaths, people who engage in this type of behavior, they tend to kind of like what they do, that they don't so much. They find the freaky perverted brains don't mind sharing the gory details with people who are not familiar with the world that they, deal in. Why are you telling all your business to these people? Because in the event that people start going to jail, You got witnesses galore. With the kids, it's kind of interesting too. Sharing the details of a lot of what's going on, to me, also opens up a lane or a reason for these people to really, really harm them. Because one, you have to intensify the terror in order to keep people quiet. And then you also have to bring them almost to the verge of death for them to completely understand that you're not anybody that should be fucked with. I think that a part of telling them puts in a person's mind, even at a very young age, because just survival, right? That psychologically, why is this bitch telling me all this shit? Is she going to kill me later? And if she kills me later, it's because I know everything that I know. It's always going to be kind of like that lingering cloud over your head that like these people keep kind of like bringing me into this. But what happens if I'm no longer a good enough pawn? They're going to off you, And I just find it interesting that he talked about being self-employed. He talked about the boss and all this other stuff. But then by the time this was investigated, the investigating officer, Michael Hoke, quickly established that this boss was Larry King. Records confirmed that the apartment, number 3B, the unit that Nelson had used for the studio, was actually leased to Larry King. And victims testified that King himself also participated in taking these photographs or directed children to Nelson for sessions. But by the time Officer Hoke arrived on May 25th, 1988, he was informed that Nelson had already moved out of the complex. He evacuated 9 days after the mother and daughter filed their complaint. Hoke found it very strange that Larry King was renting apartments in 2 towers, the Orpheum Tower and the Twin Towers, simultaneously. And according to the building's managers, King was widely rumored to be a heavy drug dealer. He dabbled too, and was suspected of having a specific preference for young men or boys. The investigation into Rusty was dropped, though. So then there was the testimony of 15-year-old Loretta Smith. Now, despite the Omaha Police Department dropping its initial probe into Rusty Nelson, Officer Earl Carmine was dispatched on June 28, 1988 to interview Loretta Smith at Richard Young Hospital. Loretta Smith told her therapist about incidents in which she had been photographed nude or partially nude, and described instances of devil worship occurring within the network. Loretta's history with the group began 5 or 6 years prior, when she was only 9 years old. Carmine described Loretta as rather articulate and mature for her years. I want to say this. The devil worship component, which we'll talk about more later, there's 2 ways to look at that, I feel. First way, a method of doing something so insane, so wild, that when people say that it happened, nobody believes it. And 2, actually, you all are Luciferians. And we'll talk about the distinction between Luciferians and Satanists as well. Because there's a satanic panic element of this. This is 1980s that came clawing through. We talking about a red state. We talking about extremely Christian, and so there is a satanic panic element. But now in 2026, knowing what we know about Satanism and Luciferians, I think it's important to kind of like dive into that a little bit. So, burn your Palo Santo, whatever you need to do. But we are going to talk about that. This girl, who's 15 by the time she's being interviewed about this, tells very explicit details of what she experienced. And my thing is, even if it is a method to make the story so unbelievable that nobody will believe it, it's still being done. So it really doesn't matter why you're doing it. Okay. Like, it just doesn't. It doesn't matter what the reason is that you are engaging in certain acts, specifically ritualistic torture and murder and sex. It doesn't really matter why. It just mattered that it is and that you do it. This girl discovered that her friends, Nellie and Kimberly Webb, were being forced into these modeling sessions at the same photo studio. And Loretta identified the North Omaha Girls Club on Lake Street as the site for recruitment and abuse, and stated that both male and female leaders from the Girls Club were active participants in the photography of nude children. This is I didn't want to mention them, but this is very Epstein-y, especially considering the use of the modeling agencies, John Luke Burnell and Paolo Zampoli, using the modeling agencies as a way to bring women in or bring children in. The opportunity to photograph nude children and call it art. The opportunity to, engage in certain behaviors under the guise of, oh, don't you want to be a star? We see that with Nickelodeon and Disney, right? Loretta, indicated that a number of these prominent individuals were doctors and lawyers, but they were all involved in the sessions, and they used these very strict code names to hide their true identities. Loretta was threatened with absolute slaughter of her entire family if she ever dared to open her mouth or resist. She was forced to consume beverages that tasted like apple juice, but she was convinced that it was spiked with drugs to keep her compliant and disoriented. And starting around age 10 or 11, Loretta was dragged into what she described as devil worship rituals. These sessions were timed perfectly with the nude photography designed to ensure that the children remained broken and obedient through sheer trauma and horror. Loretta mentioned that Nellie and Kimberly had attempted to report the activities to the police, and that Mr. Finch, the superintendent of the Fort Calhoun schools, but there was no action taken. And the girls concluded that the authorities were likely complicit or involved in the network themselves. So they were like, whatever, we're going to lose. Regardless, we're going to lose. Now, Smith initiated the conversation. Loretta initiated the conversation by indicating that, quote, approximately 5 or 6 years ago, when she was 9 years old, she went to a party with some friends much older than her. There, she met a white male who coaxed her into modeling for him. He offered to take Smith home if Smith would pose for some pictures. Initially, the unidentified white male took photographs of her with Polaroid camera of her fully clothed, although finally she agreed to pose for one completely nude photograph taken by this white male. Now, this is when things get more insane. Trigger warning. During the course of the reporting officer's interview with Loretta Isabel Smith concerning child pornography activity, as well as devil worship, she mentioned the name of Larry King as being a participant and supporter in these activities. As how she knew this, Smith stated that she is a friend of the daughter of Gary West. West is reportedly the manager of Max's. It's a predominantly homosexual bar located south of Central Station at 1415 Jackson Street. Smith stated that she had been to the West residence several times and that Gary West is a homosexual as well as an alcoholic. She stated that when he becomes intoxicated, he talks about his certain activities with Larry King, and indicated that he is into the use of controlled substances, i.e. cocaine, for personal use as well as for sale, and that he owes Larry King a lot of money for this. With regards to Larry King, she stated that she knows that he supports devil worship activities. She further indicated that King owns a house on Wirt Street, the exact location of which she did not know, but that King holds various drug and sex parties there. Smith initially told reporting officers that she had been to the Wirt house on one occasion in which she saw 3 or 4 teenage males engage in oral copulation. It became apparent when Smith began talking about King and West with a lack of specificity that she didn't wish to go into much detail with the reporting officer at this time. Reporting officer told her to consider recalling as much information as possible and that she and the reporting officer will talk again at a later date. On July 5th, Loretta Smith called Officer Carmine and gave him the specific address and phone number for the Wirt Street house. He called the number and the phone was answered King Company. And the physical location, he observed a gray awning with the name King written in the black script and lettering. Loretta's case file was eventually condensed into a 1989 report for the legislature's Franklin Committee by Jerry Lowe, which meticulously tracks the specific dates she sat down with the hospital staff to spill everything. August 19th, 1988, the hospital notes indicated that Loretta was asked to give a chronological account of involvement in what is described as devil worship cult, and that Loretta agreed to do this. Loretta indicated that she didn't really know what was happening and that she became involved very gradually. She indicated that when she was approximately 9 years old, she was going to the girls' club in Omaha and that a guy named Ray would take her and 4 or 5 other girls to a girls' club on outings. He took them to a building that, according to Loretta, looked abandoned and asked the girls if they wanted to go in, which they all agreed to do. Loretta indicated they sat and talked for a while, and then Ray provided a joint, and all the individuals got high. And she indicated this activity continued for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then Ray took them to a party. Loretta indicated that at that party, there were about 10 men, all in their mid-30s, and that initially they sat around and they talked with the girls about their problems. Loretta indicated that all the people got wasted and that the man at the party made them sleep around and that the girls did not have a choice of who they slept with. Loretta stayed away from the girl club after this for a few days. But then in order to get out of the house, she did begin going to the parties again, and they lasted for another 6 months. On one occasion, she threatened to tell her mother that the men were having sex with her and that they knew that she was only 9. But the men indicated that they would kill anyone who told about the activities. The men started taking the girls to what the men described as power meetings. Loretta advised she was 10 years old. She indicated that candles and other weird stuff were at the power meetings. And according to Loretta, one of the individuals on one occasion told the girls that the room was going to spin for a while. And it did. And she realized later that it was drugs that the men had given them. Loretta advised that about 8 months later, she was put through her first test. Her and the other girls were taken to a building in Omaha where she was locked in a room with the little girl, which she described as a Caucasian infant. At about midnight, Loretta indicated that the men came into the room, took the little girl away from her, and told her that she could achieve power by killing something that she really loved. Loretta described that they then cut the little girl's head off, stuck it on the wall, and made her sit in front of it. Loretta indicated later that she had to take the head off the wall and that the men held her down while they cut the eyes out of the little girl's head. They then left Loretta and the girl in the room, locking the door. She was later in the locked room with the little girl for 24 hours, and during this time, she could hear another one of the girls screaming. She could hear the men whipping and beating the girl. And shortly after this, the men came into the room and told Loretta that she had passed the test, and then drove her a couple of blocks from her house and let her out. Loretta indicated the next time that she saw the men, she had gone to a friend's house who was having a party, and the men just showed up. Loretta identified 2 of the men as Larry King and a Mr. Finch, who Loretta indicated was a school principal. Additionally, she identified parties as Ace, King Horse, Jerry Lucifer, and Mike. After one such party, Loretta said another girl called the police and reported that she was raped and tried to press charges. Other girls covered up the rape for the men. Loretta indicated that she, again, threatened to tell about the activities, and the men said they would kill her or her mother. At another meeting, Loretta indicated devil worshiping was practiced and that another small boy was sacrificed. Loretta and the other girls were in the room, and she could hear the little boy screaming. She then indicated the child was fried and eaten by the girls. Loretta indicated that she refused to take part in this, so that the men beat her for 2 days. At additional meetings, Loretta indicated that the men told her and the other girls that they must sacrifice for power, and described 3 incidences where further sacrifices took place. The first, a 1-year-old white female had her head taken off by a saw. The second, a 4-year-old white male was hung on the wall and darts thrown at him. And the third, an Indian female, 3 or 4 years old, had several body parts of her body cut off, after which it was ground and poured on the girls. And they were made to drink the remains of the child. On August 21st, 1988, Loretta indicated the 3rd, 4th, and 5th sacrifices took place during the spring of 1985, when she was 11, and that the parties that were at these sacrifices were Mr. Finch, King Horses, and the big guy she referred to earlier. Between the sacrifices, she indicated that the girls were tested to see if they would keep quiet and how much control that the men had over them. Loretta indicated that the men would try to scare the girls by having them watch as animals were mutilated, and also the men would threaten them by saying that instead of killing them, they would just cut off parts of bodies and torture the girls and make them suffer. Asked to provide details relative to the first sacrifice of the infant girl, Loretta indicated that at first she didn't cry, and after this the men cut the girl's eyes out. Loretta indicated that she freaked out and was screaming and hitting the walls. She said the cult members were wearing what she described as clothes, which had upside down crosses on them, and that the leaders always wore a long black cape with gold rings shaped like a skeleton head. Now, Loretta was admitted to Emmanuel Hospital in 1985 for psychiatric evaluation and treatment, returning for further treatment in January and March of 1986. Ultimately, her mother was forced to navigate the court system just to secure her a place at Uta Haley, a residential facility designed for troubled girls. But for Carol Stitt, the executive director of the Foster Care Review Board, the reports from Loretta's caseworkers were believable. Stitt, an expert in the field, stood before the legislator's executive board on December 19, 1988, to drive home the point. Quote, "As horrifying as this is when you review it, this girl is very concrete about who was present at these homicides and what was happening, dates, and one of the ways you know this is not a global fantasy is the more details they give." Basically, Loretta wasn't just in there lying or having a psychotic episode. She was providing the kind of detail that doesn't exist in childhood fantasies. The terrifying accounts of Loretta Smith, shared with hospital staff and the Omaha police, didn't just exist in a vacuum. They perfectly overlapped and were corroborated with evidence that authorities had already had from the Webb foster children and the Georgiou complaint. Across 3 distinct investigations involving pornography and child abuse and even ritual murder, every single thread of testimony converged on one man, Larry King. It was a literal collision of separate horrors, all pointing to one devil. This is the end of part 1. I wanted to get that out in part 1. I couldn't let it linger. In the next part, we're going to talk more about the cover-up, the legislature's executive board, John DeCamp's part in this, the politics behind covering up all of this. And it doesn't end with Loretta Smith. There were multiple witnesses, and according to John DeCamp, they were corroborated, but they were kind of told that they were crazy and that these stories were absolutely insane. But my biggest thing about when people say that stories like this are insane, first of all, I want to repeat, Loretta Smith is 15. She's 15. She's claiming that 6 years ago, when she was 9 years old, she was starting to be ruthlessly murdered, trafficked, all the things. She experienced this brutality. When you think about it, she starts the story basically just saying like, hey, well, we were kicking it, we were smoking a little bit, which I'm kind of like, wow. You're 10, 11 years old, but 10, 11-year-olds smoke. Kicking and smoking a little bit. Maybe you're hanging around men who are not your age, totally inappropriate, not condoning that at all. But she called the interviewing officer back with the address and phone number, which were both connected to King, and then proceeded to meticulously through Jerry Lowe, who we'll talk about Jerry Lowe later, his committee when he was investigating the scandal. She proceeded to tell the hospital staff everything. And one of my biggest issues with how people feel about this level of detail is, again, no child has this deep or horrific of an imagination. What 15-year-old do you know knows a senator or knows the names of all of these very powerful people who are one, not their age, but who just so happen. And I don't want to hear anything about, oh, she could have. There is no child that's good, that is that good. Okay, actors. But you just so happen to have found several actors that learned all of this detail. And I saved it until the end to mention that she is in a mental institution at this point, because I didn't want to go into it with preconceived notions. I wasn't just burying the lead. But I also feel like that if you did have this experience, you would probably need a psychiatric evaluation, not just once, probably 3 times. Outside of you could possibly be schizophrenic and making all of this stuff up. This is very detailed for a 15-year-old. And that's one of the parts that we're going to talk about more in part 2 is, do children make this type of stuff up? An active imagination for a 9, 10, 11-year-old is not generally watching a newborn baby or an infant having their head chopped off and their eyeballs popped out. That's not a general child fantasy. So unless they drug them and then set them in front of a TV and watched a bunch of snuff with them and they witnessed it on the screen, that still doesn't absolve these people for having these children in that sort of environment. And potentially being implicated in all sorts of heinous crimes, including sex and murder. This reminded me so very much of Sasha Riley's testimony, which I know at this point is kind of all over the place, but the original interview of that, I originally compared it to Marquis de Sade's Salo, but at the same time, is it far-fetched that a bunch of sick bitches kidnap kids? How many missing kids do we see all the time or hear about all the time? We have no idea what happened to them. Whether or not it truly has anything to do with the devil depends on your personal religious beliefs. But that doesn't change the fact that this child is recounting these horrific stories to an obscene amount of detail. That can't be glossed over. And as we go through this, we'll learn the frustration with John DeCamp, the writer, and other people on the Franklin board who's just like, we just gonna focus on the money and act like this nigga didn't engage in all sorts of sex crimes potentially. It just so happened that these children know Larry King, they know Alan Baer, they know, well, maybe they'll know the president or the vice president. They know all of these obscure men. They know Rusty Nelson, the photographer. They know King's cousin. They know King's cousin's wife. They know, not even just know them, but then they know the kids. They know the guy that's the principal of the random school. They know the superintendent. They know that they meet up with the Webbs and have hours long meeting in the middle of a school day. They know that she carries a Gucci bag. They know that he has a cocaine problem. They know that he's in the Twin Towers, that he owns a penthouse and this other unit. They just know all of that. They just know that he flies private jets, which he's getting in trouble for. You telling me there's a 15-year-old that's just sitting somewhere reading the paper about this nigga and it just decided to go to the police and say that he cuts off babies' heads? Be for real. We tend to believe in the most fantastic things, but when it comes to child abuse, kid lying. When it comes to women being abused, the woman lying. It's just like, I've said it before, believe the victim and allow room for the person who's being accused to defend themselves. But a cover-up is not you defending yourself. A cover-up is a cover-up. It's you not wanting the truth to be shown, whether it is because I always say this too. If I was a big personality, famous, crazy, and these allegations came out about me, I talked about this with like even Usher and like what he could have actually said to actually make victims feel seen and also support his friend, P. Diddy. Nigga, if that's your friend and that's the relationship you have with him, cool. But that doesn't change the fact that two things can exist in the same space. He can still be a predator. You can still feel bad for the victims. It's up to P. Diddy to prove that he didn't do anything. I said this before too. There are very few people that walk around that have awful child abuse allegations against them. If it was that easy to just pin sex crimes onto people, people would do it all the time. To everyone, anybody that they want to strong arm. I'm just going to tell everybody that you sleep with kids. That's not, I used to say the same thing about Michael Jackson, which I'm starting to kind of feel differently about Michael Jackson, but I used to say the same thing. Then when you start to think about it, and we'll talk more about DeCamp and how he had allegations at some point too. But when you start to think about it, you're kind of like, they do use tactics like this to destroy people publicly, to destroy their image, sure, to make it where people do not want to work with them anymore, especially when they rely on the public for their business ventures and things like that. People will cancel you. So I do understand how it does really affect a person. But what are the actions that could potentially lead? While I love Michael Jackson, one of the actions that I always felt was weird. Why you got all these damn kids around you? You 50. The only kids to be around you is maybe your kids' friends. At that point, why they all sleeping in the wing near your house? Why you around so many kids all the time? before you had kids. Why your house look like a kid's playground? Why your house look like an amusement park? That was the thing. It's when the chips start falling into areas where it's like, oh, it is weird. He do seem to have a little bit of a problem with kids, that you start to not necessarily feel like it's off. And while King wasn't outwardly presenting as this man who engaged in these awful crimes, it does make you wonder, why do all these kids know you? I mean, you ain't dancing around in Mickey Mouse shirts. You ain't got no amusement park house. You a politician. Why you got all these kids around you? Why are you only investing? Well, not only, but why are you so into Boys and Girls Club? And why are all these Boys and Girls Club kids claiming that you're doing stuff to them? Why is that? So next week, we're going to dig into the bureaucratic bullshit that DeCamp had to go through, that the Franklin Committee had to go through, how the Omaha police behaved, how the Omaha police was involved, how the FBI becomes involved after they start to see that this is a multi-state problem, and what ultimately happens to Franklin, who's still alive, like I said. So I'll see you all next week for part 2. Bye.